Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'd like to welcome you back to another in our series of NRL live streaming sessions and radio shows. Every other week on Wednesdays at the same time, we will discuss a new topic, and we want to encourage you to provide as much input as possible by calling or texting us with your questions or comments. The number to call is 1-844, as you can see on the screen, 1-844 424 0500. You can text or call us toll free at 1-844 424 0500. With me today is my usual co-host, Qasim Sadiq, who is the project co-lead for the Northern Road Link project. Good afternoon, Qasim.
Good afternoon, Don. How are you?
Good, thanks. We have a lot to cover, and as usual, very little time to cover it in, right?
Always.
So, for everyone's information, in today's session, we are going to discuss the second major report to be prepared as part of the planning phase of the federal impact assessment process, and that is called the Detailed Project Description, or DPD. As a bit of background, the federal impact assessment process is overseen by the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, a federal agency. Okay, Qasim, let's get started. Maybe you can do a quick run through of what we are going to cover today, and if we can switch to slide number 2, please.
So, in today's session, we will review the main phases in the impact assessment process, talk about the planning phase, describe the detailed project description in detail, talk about the general requirements within the DPD, break down the key components of the DPD, and then lastly, talk about the final step, which is impact assessment determination.
Thank you, Qasim. Okay, let's start now with a high-level review of the impact assessment process. There are 5 main phases in the impact assessment process. The first phase is planning. The second phase is the impact statement, followed by the impact assessment phase, then the decision-making phase, and the post-decision phase. And we are currently in the planning phase of the process right now. And the DPD the detailed project description sits within the planning phase as well. So Qasim, maybe you can continue by starting with a review of phase 1, planning, to show our viewers and listeners where the DPD sits in terms of the process.
Yes, absolutely, Don. I also just wanted to recognize that we're attempting a live translation as well, so that's why our pace of speech is just a little bit slower than usual. But let's talk a little bit about the planning phase. So the planning phase, as we've discussed previously, IAC describes it as a stage in which the public and Indigenous people are invited to provide information and contribute to planning the assessment. The first step in doing so is the development of the initial project description, which is prepared by the proponent. Once that is prepared and it goes through its own process, the next step or the next deliverable is called the detailed project description. That is prepared again by the proponent. The agency, based on that, determines if an impact assessment is required. At this stage, we assume that an impact assessment would be required by the Northern Road Link, but we would have definitive certainty once the agency issues a notification, a notice of determination, which tells us that an impact assessment is required. And if it is required, the agency would also issue a tailored impact statement guideline, which is prepared by the agency as well.
Thank you, Qasim. Let's move now to the DPD, the detailed project description, and get into more detail. So the detailed project description responds to the summary of issues that is prepared by IAC after the initial project description is submitted. The DPD is the main basis, the main sort of source of information from which IAC, the federal regulator, makes a decision as to whether an impact assessment is required. And it also informs the tailored impact statement guidelines if an impact assessment is required. So IAC reviews the DPD to determine if it meets all the requirements, the information requirements, within 10 days of receiving it. And once they accept the DPD, it goes to what's called the registry, which is basically a public area website where it's available for download and viewing. And then IAC makes a determination as to whether an impact assessment is required within 10 calendar days of accepting the detailed project description. Qasim, let's begin looking at the general requirements of the DPD, if you can run through those for us.
Absolutely, Don. So the general requirements of the DPD basically ask for an accurate representation of the project at the time of the submission. Things might have changed between the initial creation of the IPD and DPD based on consultation, comments, and further planning. Based on that, every available information would have to be represented accurately at the time of submission. There's a need to include information related to any option being considered by the proponent regarding any item in the project description. So if there's an option or an alternative way of doing things that would have to be described in the detailed project description. We must also include the proponent's responses to the issues raised during any consultation undertaken. What that means is that all the activity that's taken place, the conversations that have taken place, the engagement and consultation activity that's taken place, as that leads to questions from Indigenous communities, the public, government ministries, the proponent has to respond to those. And those responses are included in the detailed project description. These should be as detailed as possible so that the agency can determine whether or not an impact assessment is required. So this is the main document that helps the agency make a decision. So detail is very important because it enables the agency's decision based on data and information provided.
Thank you, Qasim. Again, the intent of the DPD is to provide as full and complete picture of the project as possible because, as you said, it's the main source of information used as the basis for deciding whether there will be an impact assessment or not. Okay, let's move along now to slide number 7 and look at the key components of a detailed project description. So there are a number of important components of a detailed project description. The first is any updates to general information, and by general information I mean project name, contact information, etc. Uh, Planning phase results. So the planning phase, so any engagement or consultation that has occurred during the planning phase, the responses to the summary of issues that has been prepared by IAC after receiving the initial project description. Project information is another key component, and that is information like project purpose and need and potential benefits of the project. There is also an information requirement for location information and context to describe geographically and legally where the project is. Information is also required on federal, provincial, territorial, Indigenous, or municipal involvement as well. And another key component is potential effects of the project as well. That's a very, very critical component of a DPD as well. And then finally, the other component is the plain language summary, which is prepared in both English and French. And in our case, it will likely be prepared in both Cree and OG Cree for the Indigenous communities in the region as well. So those are sort of the key components. And maybe now, Qasim, you can go through the planning phase results that need to be included in the detailed project description.
So in the planning phase, the results, the detailed project description pretty much represents the end of the planning phase. So those results are presented in the DPD. Summary of results of any engagement that's undertaken with Indigenous communities or other parties is presented in the DPD. A description of how the proponent will address issues raised in the summary of issues, which is a document received from the agency. So that's included in the DPD. Description of how the proponent will address issues, including the perspective of Indigenous groups regarding potential adverse project impacts on their rights, is included. So there's a section that discusses how impacts on Indigenous rights would be mitigated from in terms of the potential adverse effects on their rights from the project. There's a need to identify changes made to the IPD as part of the responses to issues. So the detailed project description builds on the initial project description. It's not a brand new document. So the changes that you make, you identify those changes, those additions, the new information presented, or things that are just different from the IPD based on changes that might have taken place since the IPD was published. And then lastly, there's a need to identify any project relevant studies or plans that might be taking place within the project area, such as a regional or strategic assessment. And if that is the case, the proponent is required to identify that in the detailed project description, Don.
Thank you, Qasim. Next, let's look at some of the other information requirements of the DPD, the project information. So if we can switch to slide number 9, please. So in terms of project information, some of the requirements are an updated purpose and need for the project. Uh, Another thing is to provide details as to how the project meets the provisions in what's called the schedule to the physical, what's called the physical activities regulations. Also is required is a description of all activities, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's permanent or temporary, primary or ancillary, um, physical works associated with all phases of the project, meaning construction, planning, construction, operation, and then to provide any details such as purpose, size, and capacity where they're available to help again paint that sort of detailed picture as possible about the project for both the public and for the regulatory agency, in this case, IAC. Other information about the project that's required is description of physical activities that are not directly but incidental to the designated project. Identify who's part of it would be involved, identifying who's doing those activities, what the relationship is between who's doing that to the proponents, and then any associated federal or provincial regulatory requirements. Other information would be an estimate of the maximum capacity of the project. In this case, we're talking about an all-season road. So in this case, we would be talking about maybe the maximum daily traffic estimated, predicted for the road. All other information required would be a schedule of all phases of the project, including key project activities, not just construction, not just planning, not just operation, but breaking that down into key activities. And then finally, potential alternative ways of carrying out or doing the project, and then potential alternatives. And these would have to be, technically and economically feasible or reasonable in terms of being able to do or execute. Maybe now, Qasim, you can talk a little bit about some of the location and locational context information that's required, because that's a very important information requirement of the DPD.
It absolutely is, Don. So in the DPD, one of the key things that you must undertake as a proponent is to identify the geography and the location of the project. So that includes the geographic coordinates of the project and ancillary facilities. So ancillary facilities would be anything that's required for the construction and maintenance of the project. So for example, for the Northern Road Link, an aggregate source which is required for construction and then maintenance in the future would be considered an ancillary facility. And then you might need access roads to gain access to aggregate sources. That's another example. So you define the geographic coordinates of the project and locations of the ancillary facilities as well. There's a requirement to identify the spatial boundaries of study corridors. Now, that's just a way of saying that we have to conduct studies on a certain area, and we define what that geographic area is as the proponent. Then you also define the spatial extent of consultation area, which is a way of saying that consultation has to take place on the project, but that consultation has to take place within a geographic boundary. Where, for example, we're not going to consult the entire province of Ontario on the Northern Road Link, while members of the public are absolutely welcome to provide comments. But there is a more focused approach on a certain geography for the project, and that is defined. The land on which the project goes, there's a need to describe it legally. Who owns the land? What is the status of the land from a legal perspective? We also need to identify any reserve lands around the project. Now, for example, this project, Northern Road Link, is entirely on Martin Falls and Webequie traditional territory. So the two reserves are the closest reserves to the project as well. So we identified those, but then zooming out some neighboring communities as well, who would be included in some of the studies we conduct, because there will potentially be larger impacts of the project beyond the exact footprint of the project. And then as the project goes on, we'll talk about what they might be and how they're minimized. We also look at land used for traditional purposes by Indigenous people within a certain geography. Again, this is entirely, as I just said, Don. The project itself is entirely on Martin Falls and Webequie traditional territory. So this is entirely traditional territory, essentially, where this project is. Uh, the DPD is a document required for a federal process. So as part of that, we are required to identify any federal lands that are associated with the project boundary areas. We describe the physical and biological environment of the project. And then lastly, for context, also a description of health, social, and the economic context of the overall geographic area where the project happens to be. So those are some key components of the detailed project description. So really trying to give readers a sense of where this place is exactly on a map, what the location is, and what does it look like at this point in terms of its use and its nature.
Oh, thank you, Qasim. No, the locational information is extremely important. Again, in painting that picture of the project and helping the federal ministry, helping identify the not only well, also the experts that they need, but just giving them that basis, the general basis for making decisions about the project as well too. So let's now look at those information requirements related to federal, provincial, Indigenous, or municipal involvement. If we can go to slide number 11, please. So the information that's being looked for here is whether financial support has been provided by different federal authorities, whether federal lands are sit within the project area, and then information on the permits, licenses, or authorizations that might be required by different jurisdictions at different levels of government, um, that have powers or functions related to assessing the environmental effects of the project. And then finally, describing changes to the environment or to the health, social, or economic conditions that that may occur in Canada that they're either directly related to or incidental to a federal authority that might provide a permit or enable the project to be carried out. So those are the information components related to the different levels of government. Qasim, maybe now you can talk a little bit about potential project effects and the DPD summary that's required, which is slide number 12.
So there's a section within the DPD that asks for a description of potential effects of the project, as well as a section which summarizes the overall DPD. So the potential effects section requires a description of any changes caused to fish and fish habitat, aquatic species, and migratory birds as a result of carrying out the project. So anything that impacts these valued components requires a description of that potential effect. There's a requirement to describe any changes to the environment that may occur on federal lands, other provinces, or outside of Canada as well. This project is fairly far north, but as listeners can appreciate, many projects happen very close to the border with the U.S. So that's a matter for projects like that. There's a need to describe any impacts on Indigenous people, whether that's related to physical and cultural heritage, whether that's related to health, social, or economic conditions of Indigenous peoples, current use of lands and resources for traditional purposes, and then any structure, site, or thing that is of historical, archaeological, paleontological, or architectural significance. So any sort of any cultural or historical landmark or feature. So there would have to be a description of any impact to these features. Then an estimate of project greenhouse gas emissions is required, as is an estimate of likely waste and emissions from the project to the air, water, or land during phases associated with the project, which in the Northern Road Links case would be both construction and operation. It is a road. It's expected to have a very, very long life, and decommissioning is not a part of the project at this point, or it's not conceived to be a component of the project in the future as well. And then associated management plans would also be described in the DPD. Now, we've talked about all the different components of the DPD. That makes it a somewhat long document with a lot of information and detail. So at one part of the DPD then becomes just a summary of the overall document. And the requirement from the federal government is that the DPD summary should be a plain language summary, which is to be provided in English and French. That is the typical requirement for all projects. In our case, as the Northern Road Link, we also produce plain language summaries in other local languages like OG Cree and Cree.
And you know, Kasam, that goes back to the transparency of this process. You and I have talked about it on a number of occasions over the last few weeks, and the openness of this process, and by translating, you know, the summary document into a number of languages, the intent is to obviously reach as many people as possible, and then also putting it in plain language so that non-technical people can at least follow and be able to follow it to the point where they can ask questions. It's really important. So that summary is extremely important. And what I will do next is I will finish the final slide, and we do have a Facebook question that we'll tackle once I do the final slide. So if we can go to slide number 13. And I will talk briefly about the impact assessment determination. And this is the sort of the final phase, final part of the planning phase, where the DPD is reviewed and a determination as to whether an IA or impact assessment is required is done. And this is done within 10 calendar days of accepting the DPD, provided it meets all the informational requirements. If it does, it's formally accepted. 10 days pass, and within that 10 days, the decision has to be made. And that decision on the impact assessment is based on a number of factors, including the IPD, the DPD, and the response to the summary of issues, the possibility that the project might cause negative effects on in areas that are under federal jurisdiction, or any direct or incidental effects. Other factors might be negative impacts the project might have on the rights of Indigenous people. Um, Other factors might be relevant regional or strategic assessments that are being conducted under the Impact Assessment Act in the area, and other studies or plans that have been prepared by different jurisdictions, you know, within the same region, and any other factors as well. So there's a lot going into that impact assessment decision or determination. And then once IAC makes their decision, this is then posted on the registry as to whether or not the IA is required, and it'll provide reasons for that decision. So we are almost done our we are done our presentation, Qasim, but I do have a question here that I will put out there to both of us. And the question is, via Facebook, do you describe existing disturbances to the land, such as those from mineral exploration? So that's a very interesting question. And I
That is
think that would get captured to the degree possible in setting that scene, right? Setting that scene about the project.
so there's a section within the DPD in which we do provide information about activities like that around the project. Um, but access to information is based on, sorry, the information presented in the DPD is based on information available to the project. And whatever information is available is presented. Now, what I'm not too sure about, Don, is what is meant by disturbance to the land, and it might be the question. I think my interpretation would be that this relates to any drilling that's taking place or
Yeah.
has taken place, and what that might be, and if there's any more activity that's more advanced than that. So that's something we're going to present in terms of information on other projects around us. But again, the presentation of information is subject to data available.
Well, that's it, Qasim. And one thing that it clearly states in the description of what is required for a DPD is that that information, that background information that is to be provided, is any publicly available information. So whatever's available publicly and whatever might have been compiled as part of maybe previous studies can be is expected to be included to the degree possible. So that hopefully answers that question. And it looks like, Qasim, we are out of time. That went by pretty quickly, didn't it? That 30 minutes, 32
It
minutes actually.
absolutely, yeah, absolutely did,
Uh,
Don. And I'm just going to quickly add that it is also important to remember that the DPD, we talked about DPD generally, but the Northern Road Link is focused on a road project. And any other project in the area, particularly mining, would require the same process that we're following today. So they would have to go through their own independent assessment processes and provide the same level of information. So I think that's also just an important thing for our listeners to know, that these assessments are independent, and every project has to go through their own.
oh, that's a very good point, Qasim. I'm glad you mentioned that. So that wraps up today's NRL discussion, and I'd like to thank you, Qasim, for sharing your thoughts again. This was a good discussion, and I hope our listeners and viewers have a better idea now of what's involved in a detailed project description, and we'll be back again in 2 weeks to when we continue our discussion on various topics related to the federal and provincial impact and environmental assessment processes. And we encourage you to visit our website at northernroadlink.ca or follow us on social media via NRL Roadlink. So, Qasim, again, thank you very much. And we will see everyone in 2 weeks. And thank you for listening. Miigwech.
Thank you.